Right. Move that over there. Come on. I think I can just give it one more tick on the zoom to make life easier. All right, we'll give it one more minute as people continue with their login process and make sure that everyone is able to get connected as they wish.
Excuse me, Rabbi, does your background screen have particular relevance to today's discussion?
Well, it does, at least a little obliquely.
That's
so,
what, yeah. I thought it might. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just going to say I try to set my background screen each week to something related to the parasha.
Okay.
So as Jacob and Esau are essentially an argument about sheep, at least to one level, I thought having a few sheep with me would be a good idea.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we are at about the point where we can go ahead and get things underway. So good afternoon to everyone, whether you're on Zoom or YouTube. We are going to continue our discussion of the Abrahamic family, but we are continuing down the line that actually was the focus of Abraham, that is to say, Abraham to Isaac. Toldot discusses Isaac's life, but no portion of Isaac's life is more famous than the giving of the blessing to Jacob instead of Esau. This is an incredibly famous passage, one that we've looked at different elements of before. Hopefully you'll still find some new insights from our discussion today. And in it, we are picking up midway. That is because when we've discussed before, we usually stop midway. And so we're going to deal more with the repercussions. But just a little bit of background information. Suffice it to say for the moment that Isaac was going on with doing Isaac's life. And at a certain point when he had become blind and old, he decided he needed to give his blessing to the next generation. Isaac decides that he will give his blessing to his eldest son, Esau. And so he asks Esau to prepare him a meal, and then he will give him the blessing. As Esau heads out to go get food, it turns out that Rivka had been listening, Rebecca, that is Isaac's wife, and she believes that Yaakov, Jacob, deserves the blessing more. And so she concocts a scheme involving dressing him up like his brother and wearing sheepskin to be hairy like his brother and preparing food that is of the same taste as his brother's food, and to then have Jacob go in to his blind father and try to pass himself off as Esau to receive the blessing. That seems to work. And then Esau comes back and he is, shall we say, upset that his blessing has gone to his brother. And that's where we're going to pick up our story. So we are on chapter 27, verse 36, and we have Esau in his internal dialogue, or at least it feels internal, complaining about what just happened, and then going through the repercussions with his father and onwards. So hopefully that gave everybody at least enough of a background. I like I said, I imagine for most of the people studying with me, this story of Jacob and Esau and Isaac is fairly well known. So hopefully we can rely on past knowledge for the first half, and we can delve a little deeper on the second half here. So verse 36. Esau, that starts off with the he verb, and he is the antecedent noun. Esau said, "Was he then named Jacob that he might supplant me these two times?" Making a play off of the name Yaakov, which is a root which can mean heel, which is where it is derived originally when he comes out holding on to the heel of Jacob. But it can also mean to supplant or trick or overtake. So he is making a joke about his brother's name, a very bitter joke. First, he took away my birthright, and now he has taken away my blessing. So the birthright is also the story at the beginning of the parasha where Jacob doesn't exactly take away, but engages in a little salesmanship of selling some food for the birthright, remembering that the birthright was the additional inheritance portion set aside for the eldest child by custom at that time. So Jacob had already secured more of the inheritance than Esau. And now Esau is saying, not only did he get that, but he has also taken the blessing. And he added, have you not reserved a blessing for me? To his father, he makes this pitiful cry, is there no blessing left for me then? Right? Am I really going to not get any blessing from you, my father? Verse 37. Isaac answered, saying to Esau, but I have made him master over you. I have given him all his brothers for servants and sustained him with grain and wine. What then can I still do for you, my son? The earlier blessing that Isaac made when he thought it was Jacob or thought it was Esau really did put Jacob in quite the enviable position. And Esau said to his father, have you but one blessing, father? Bless me too, father. And Esau wept aloud. One has to be moved, whatever you might think of Esau in general, and we will talk about that. You have to be moved by his heartfelt desire to be blessed, to actually have the blessing from his father. This seems to matter greatly to him, and he is saying just one blessing, please. So, verse 39, we see his response. And his father Isaac answered him, saying, see, your abode shall enjoy the fat of the earth and the dew of the heaven above. Yet by your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restive, you shall break his yoke from your neck. So a very interesting blessing to give him. First by saying, yes, you will enjoy the blessings of the earth and the sky. So there will be prosperity for you. But to also say that you are going to have a violent life and you will serve your brother, but you do eventually have an opportunity to break free. This idea of breaking the yoke from the neck. The yoke was the wooden collar that an ox would be forced to wear in order to pull a wagon or pull a plow. And the idea of breaking the yoke is breaking free of that control, that grasp of power from another source. Verse 41, we see that Esau is still not exactly happy. Now Esau harbored a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing which his father had given him. And Esau said to himself, let but the mourning period of my father come, and I will kill my brother Jacob. So he is saying that as soon as dad's dead, I'm going to kill the guy, right? It's basically he is biding his time because he was not willing to kill Jacob during his father's life. He's waiting, respectfully until his father dies to kill his brother. When the words of her older son Esau were reported to Rebekah, meaning that this idea of his grudge and his plans were not apparently very secretive, she sent for her younger son Jacob and said to him, your brother Esau is consoling himself by planning to kill you. Right? This is how he's making himself feel better, by planning to murder, which is telling us a little bit about Esau's personality. We'll come back again to who he was as a person in our commentary discussion, but he is the sort of person that at least feels at the short term that things would be better and I would feel better if I murdered my brother when the time was right. So we move to verse 43 and we get the plan. Now, my son, listen to me. Flee at once to Haran, to my brother Lavan. I stay with him a while until your brother's fury subsides, until your brother's anger against you subsides, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will fetch you from there. Let me not lose you both in one day, meaning both you as well as my husband Isaac. If he dies and then Esau murders you, that means I will lose both my husband and my favorite son, as we saw earlier in Toldot, on that same day. And Rivka is not happy about the idea. So she has a plan. the plan will be that she goes to live with the family. He goes back to Haran, and he lives there until he is no longer quite so hot and angry that he will forget what you have done to him. Now, do we believe that Esau will forget? Probably not. Will he forget the pain enough that he is no longer murderous? I think that's what is Rivka's goal here. Notice, however, that also, like in every good conspiracy, she frames it as being what Jacob did to Esau, not what we did to Esau. From Esau's point of view, it certainly seems to have been Jacob that was the main issue. Whether or not he knows about his mother's involvement, we're not sure. But Rivka is distancing herself from what happened and is not taking equal credit for the deception that was perpetrated. So the plan is that he will go off to Haran, he will stay with his uncle Lavan, and then she'll let him know when it's safe to come back. Verse 26. Rebekah said to Isaac, I am disgusted with my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries a Hittite woman like these from among the native women, what good will life be to me? Right, so she is lamenting again in much the same way that she lamented when she was carrying Jacob and Esau inside of her during the difficult pregnancy, that the wives of Esau, who were Hittite, are troubling her so much that it's like, why did I even bother having children if this is what is going to happen? Right? It was better for me to just die than for this to go on. And so she suggests that there should be an alternative for Jacob. And of course, we know what that alternative is going to be because she has already been conspiring with Jacob prior to beginning this conversation. She comes in with the primary excuse that she wants Jacob to marry somebody different than one of the local women. And verse 28 picks up chapter 28 picks up the consequences of this. Again, I will remind our participants, the chapter breaks are not built into Judaism. The chapter breaks were added in the Middle Ages by Christian scribes, and they do not necessarily reflect where we would naturally make a division. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but there's nothing wrong with going across a chapter and continuing the same theme. So Isaac sent for Jacob and blessed him. He instructed him, saying, you shall not take a wife from among the Canaanite women. Up, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take a wife there from among the daughters of Lavan, your mother's brother. May El Shaddai bless you, make you fertile and numerous, so that you become an assembly of peoples. May he grant you the blessing of Abraham to you. May he grant the blessing of Abraham to you and your offspring, that you may possess the land where you are sojourning, which God assigned to Abraham. So we see that that Isaac is blessing him. Now, he blessed him once already when he thought he was Esau, and now he is blessing him again, knowing that he is Jacob. Having called for Jacob, he blesses Jacob. And he gives him the instruction of don't marry a Canaanite woman like your brother, and instead go back to your mother's house and marry one of the daughters of Lavan, one of the children from that part of the family, which would have been perfectly fine for cousins to marry during that time. It was a relatively normal practice. And then he continues with the details of the blessing that may El Shaddai bless you, make you fertile, make you numerous, so that you can become an assembly of peoples, which absolutely turns out to be true with the 12 tribes. May he grant you the blessing of Abraham, right? He is saying specifically, Birkat Avraham, the blessing of Abraham goes with you and with your children, your seed, your line. And may you possess the land that God gave to Abraham, meaning the land of Canaan. So Isaac too is saying, you're going to go, you're going to get married, you're going to have lots of kids, and you will return because this land belongs to you. This land is part of your inheritance. Now, all of this blessing might feel a little surprising. One of the consequences of where the story breaks and chapter 28 being a separate chapter is many people finish reading with chapter 27, and they don't see that in chapter 28, there is conversation between Isaac and Jacob. There is more to their relationship than just Jacob sneaking off after having stolen the blessing. And not only is there more to their relationship, but Isaac is willing to give a blessing to Jacob that is quite effusive. He is not holding back, and he is specifically and categorically naming that Jacob indeed will inherit the primary blessing, the Birkat Avraham, the blessing of Abraham, that was passed from Abraham to Isaac and now Isaac to Jacob. So this should come as a little bit of a shock if you were paying attention in chapter 27, that Isaac would, after his statement of, whoa, I can't believe something like that just happened, would back it up with the blessing that he is giving here in chapter 28. So to reconcile all of that, as well as to understand a little bit more about Jacob and Esau themselves and what they represent within Judaism, we're going to turn to our commentary. But before we do, any questions or comments from the portions that we've read from 27 and 28 this morning? All right, then let's go ahead and jump into our commentary. Okay, so the first thing we have to come to terms with is this relationship between Isaac and Jacob, Yitzchak and Yaakov, and what happens at the beginning of chapter 28. And Ha'amak Davar tries to give us some understanding of why it's worded the way it is. Yitzchak called. You may have noticed right after Rivka gave him the idea, it says that Isaac calls for Jacob. That's not always necessary. Oftentimes in many texts, the person will simply say, and Isaac said to Jacob, and would just go straight into the conversation. This calling of Jacob is begging for some interpretation. What is his view? Yaakov was embarrassed to come to Yitzchak on his own after having deceived him, right? Jacob was avoiding Isaac. I mean, you've just cheated your father and your brother. It's not like you're just going to come back to the dinner table the next day and sit down like nothing's happened. Jacob is avoiding Isaac, but Isaac is calling him in. And what does that signify? By calling him, Yitzchak gave his retroactive approval of Yaakov's deed. That by having this additional conversation and blessing, Jacob is basically saying, yeah, I know you cheated, but it's okay. That this is Isaac signing off on what just happened in chapter 27. That Isaac does not seem to be holding a grudge at this point. He seems to be okay with what Jacob did. And that is quite surprising. That is something that's going to need more explanation of why that would be the case. But there is an additional line that I wanted to share from this commentary: set out and go. This line that comes for his instructions, right? Kum lech, get up, go. This is a veiled warning that he should flee for his safety, which implies that Isaac is not quite as blind as maybe we think. That Yitzchak actually had heard what Esav was planning, that at least he knew that there was bad blood between them. And thus, this idea of Rivka to get Jacob out of the land and to Haran was not just a cover story for Yitzchak. He was not so oblivious and naive. He realized that getting Jacob out of the country was probably a good idea at this time. How much did he know about Esau's murderous vendetta plans? We're not 100% sure from this commentator's point of view, but that may have been part of why he believes that Isaac is indeed willing to sign off on the blessing from 27, even if it's only retroactively. Perhaps Yitzchak, having learned that Esav was planning bloodshed, realizes that maybe the blessing belonged on Yaakov's head a little more in any case, that maybe he was right not to end up giving the blessing to somebody that is just biding their time before engaging in murder. So that could indeed be part of the calculation that's going on here. I should point out, just in case you're wondering, or in case you are an extreme Esau sympathizer, even the greatest theft, no matter how much you have stolen, is never punishable by death. That is a very cardinal point within Jewish law. There is no such thing as the death penalty for any form of theft. Something which, by the way, was not true, meaning that we did execute people for theft all the way up into the 20th century in many parts of the Western world. But for about 3,000 years, Judaism has said no property is worth taking a life. You can defend your life if somebody is trying to take it, even if their primary goal is your property. If they're also willing to kill you, you can defend yourself, but you cannot kill someone as revenge for what they have stolen. All right, so we see that Isaac is retroactively giving approval here, perhaps because he realizes the danger from Esau. Perhaps he is realizing that maybe Yaakov was the better recipient, but it's a little bit unclear. So let's see what some other people want to say about this. Or HaChaim has a different view. He wants to look at Esau and Esau's plans in all of this and Esau's failure to execute them. So Esau was aware of Jacob's departure and of its nature, meaning that he thereby fulfilled both a commandment by his father and a mother and the commandment to look for a wife. So Esau knows that Jacob is leaving. He knows that he was leaving at his mother and father's insistence, and he knows that he is leaving to fulfill the commandment of getting married. And with that knowledge, knowing that Isaac had blessed Jacob to complete his undertaking successfully, when he says, get up and go and get a family, I bless you, Esau did not bother to pursue Jacob, realizing that under such circumstances, he would not succeed. This answers an important question, which you may or may not have been thinking, which is, why is Jacob leaving going to make him safe? Won't that make him more vulnerable? He steps outside the territory that Isaac is in, the area where maybe Rebekah can give some protection. Isn't Esau just going to hunt him down? I mean, after all, that is Esau's job, right? Esau is a hunter. So why wouldn't his departure make him more vulnerable? Well, it says, Or HaChaim, even Esau recognized that Jacob going off on a mission for his father and mother and to fulfill the commandment of having a wife and doing so with the explicit blessing of Isaac is going to put all of the elements of the world on Jacob's side. And Esau realizes that he just simply can't win under that circumstance. He is going to have to wait a little bit longer, which is trying to also highlight for us the idea that when you are engaged in pursuing a commandment, you are more likely to succeed than when you are doing the opposite. That it is not exactly a talisman, but it is certainly a boost to your odds of success when what you are trying to do is a mitzvah. So, questions or comments before we get back into that question of why was Isaac giving that second blessing at all? Okay, don't see anybody in the chat on YouTube and don't see anyone unmuting on Zoom. So let's go ahead and move on to Rabbeinu Bachya, who always has a fascinating perspective. So he starts off with the question that I've been trying to bring to our attention. Why did Yitzchak bless Yaakov again? Why the extra blessing in 28 after having already given a blessing in 27, a blessing that was, essentially stolen? Well, the Torah wanted to make it clear that the fact that Yitzchak had not been aware whom he had blessed was totally irrelevant. And it didn't matter that he was tricked. It didn't matter that he was blind. Although, as we've talked about in previous classes, there are some commentators who say that Yitzchak did know at the moment of the blessing what was going on. But in any event, even if he hadn't, it would have been irrelevant. And Yaakov's blessing was confirmed beyond dispute, and that even Esau was fully aware of it. So this chapter 28 additional blessing is an important step of making sure that we, the reader, recognize that the blessing of Jacob was not illegitimate in the sense that it does have full weight standing, full good faith credit, that this was an actual blessing that stuck, not something that would have been removed. And why would that be important to the reader? Because he's not focusing here on the issue for the characters, but for the Torah reader itself. because we need to, as Jewish people, to recognize that the blessing that was given to Jacob, which is a blessing that we have inherited, is a durable blessing, that it has not been canceled, removed, supplanted, transferred, or anything else. That it was, regardless of the circumstances under which it was given, it was a blessing that continues to be a full faith and credit blessing to the Jewish people to this day. Now, he goes on for another explanation for why this was needed, this time drawing from the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, which writes that the second blessing was necessary as there had been a weakness concerning the validity of the original blessing. So it was perfectly fine. But if there was a weakness, this weakness was now eliminated. And it was clear to everyone that Yaakov's blessing was legal, beyond any doubt or dispute. The blessing received by Yaakov here were in the nature of a confirmation, a stamp, if you will, on the original blessing. Without such confirmation, there would still be people accusing Jacob of having snatched the blessing away from Esau. It also showed that if Yaakov had not agreed to become part of the short-lived charade to show his father how easily he could be tricked, he would have obtained the blessing due him anyway. So we'll hold off on that last line, but just the middle section is the main continuation of what he's bringing to us, which is, it wasn't that the first blessing wasn't legit. It was that the first blessing did not seem to have public standing, that people would continue to doubt, dispute, and attack that blessing. And that additional blessing in chapter 28 was there not to give a blessing, but to prove to everyone else that the original blessing which had been given was indeed a blessing and was indeed going to withstand any accusation. So this ratification doesn't change anything except the public perception of what had happened in chapter 27. Following that logic? All right. And then this last line is another beautiful bit of logical thinking. He says, look, what actually happened by the whole dress up and costume party thing was to show Isaac that he could be tricked. Because we all know, if we have read more of the commentary, that Esau had tricked his father, that Esau made Isaac think that he was a righteous person, that he made Isaac think that he was a good man, that he made Isaac unaware of all of the crimes that he was out committing. And Jacob, by dressing up in sheep's clothing and in Esau's clothing, was basically trying to give a lesson to Isaac that if I can trick you like this, then Esau can trick you as well. And that means that you should recognize that indeed the blessing really belonged to Isaac, or belonged to Jacob anyway. It didn't really belong to Esau because you had been tricked by him first, and I was only tricking you to undo his trickery. All right. How do we like that logic?
It's unsatisfying because what keeps leaping out at me is in the second blessing, the use of El Shaddai, which has a very specific connotation about fertility that isn't necessarily in the first blessing. So there is a different aspect of God that is in God's power that is being brought out in the second blessing, the ratification. And it is a ratification, but there's something else there too that isn't in the first one.
Right. So we could argue that the second blessing is actually exceeding the first blessing by adding something new to it. And if that's the case, then all the more so, it shows that Isaac is fully on board with whatever happened in chapter 27, because you don't give even more to the second blessing than the first if you were angry or regretted that first one. So we do seem to have Isaac on board with what's going on here. Exactly why and how much, that still is open for debate and discussion. Like you said, this is not 100% satisfying, which is why there's always more than one commentary on any particular idea. But this seems to be, from Jacob's point of view, enough. He is satisfied. But what about Esau's point of view? Is he satisfied? What has he learned from all of this? What was he looking for in the first place? Well, that's the direction we're going to try and spend a little time. So Rashbam says that Esau concluded from what we see in chapter 28 that he had been deprived of his share in the land as a penalty for marrying Canaanite girls. And this was why Yaakov had been successful in stealing the blessing of Abraham. He decided to marry into Abraham's family, a descendant of Ishmael. He thought that perhaps by doing this, he would restore his claim to Abraham's heritage. So Rashbam introduces us this idea of the part that we didn't get to read because of time and where we're focusing, that after what happened with Jacob leaving and now going off to get a wife because Rivka was so unhappy, and Isaac by extension seemed to be unhappy with the local girls, that we see that Esau decides, well, you know what? It could be that I didn't get the Birkat Avraham, the blessing of Abraham, the right to this land, because of my spouse, because I had married the Hittites. And maybe if I marry into Abraham's family, another part of the family, maybe I too will be able to then reclaim Abraham's heritage. And so he marries a descendant of Ishmael, which is, you remember, one of the other factions of Abraham's family, Abraham being the progenitor of multiple nations, Ishmael, and as eventually we'll see, Esau as well. So here we have Esau listening, paying attention, and trying to do what's right, at least to some limited capacity. And he is doing so to restore that claim to Abraham's heritage. And the question really is, well, what was Abraham's heritage? What was it that Esau was really after? Well, he had already given up his birthright. What was he after in this blessing? And what was he hoping to reclaim? And that's going to be our next section. So slightly long commentary. I don't think I can get it all on one page. No, that's right. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what he has to say. So we have to accept two premises by everything that we've seen in the back and forth between Jacob, Esau, and Isaac. We have to accept these two premises, says Akedat Yitzchak. Jacob did not really aim at the birthright, meaning when Jacob bought the birthright from Esau, it wasn't really the extra inheritance that was his primary goal. And two, neither of the two brothers was concerned with inheriting Isaac's material wealth. Even the honor connected with the birthright was of no real concern to either Jacob or Esau. Both were deeply desirous of acquiring things of genuine value, goodness, things which can only be secured by means of heavenly blessing. In this respect, we must view the birthright as profoundly related to the divine blessings and Isaac's power to direct such blessings. All right, so what he is trying to argue here is that Esau's concern, have you no blessing for me? What about me? And I need a blessing, can only be understood as being an acknowledgement by Esau and Jacob as well, we assume, that the true thing that matters is the blessing, that there is something of unique and good value, good with a capital G, in the blessing from Isaac, the blessing of Abraham, that cannot be accomplished just by the normal mundane ways of life. Esau is essentially admitting and desiring that he have a good life, a life blessed by heaven. What good is the birthright to either of them if they don't have that blessing from Isaac, that blessing of God, that blessing of Abraham? What would that blessing do that they couldn't accomplish on their own if they were going to be purely material people? After all, Esau could accomplish whatever he wanted simply by the strength of arms and his own force of personality. And indeed, we find out in Beishlach, when Jacob comes back, that Esau has materially done quite well for himself. He does not seem to be lacking for anything, and he seems quite content with his lot in life. The real question is the blessing, this gift of goodness that he wanted, and that seems to be, according to Akedat Yitzchak, what both of the brothers were actually after. And you can argue then that when Esau sold his birthright, it was because he didn't care about the inheritance. It doesn't show him just as being an impetuous and impulsive and short-thinking person. It shows that he didn't care about the inheritance because what mattered to him was the blessing. And that leads us to the second half of the comment. Isaac was not reconciled to the fact that Jacob had obtained the blessing by deceit until Esau cried out, "He took my birthright, and now he has taken my blessing." Only then did Isaac say to Esau, "I have made him an overlord over you." So let me just do a quick reminder, quick flashback to our original blessing that we saw. Sorry, there. So we saw that he complains about having been stolen, and this is after they've already said, "Hey, sorry, he took your blessing." And he says, but he took my birthright and my blessing. And then he says, "Yeah, that's right. I made him master over you." Right? That there is this resignation, if you will, that happens with Isaac, that he is fully aware at that point that indeed this is the way it's going to work. And why did he that transition point is he recognizes that indeed this is the way it is supposed to be, that this is how things are meant to work out. Whether it happened in the way he wanted or not, this seems to be what was actually the plan all along. And that's why it goes on to say, when Esau questioned his father, saying, "Have you only one blessing, father?" Isaac quite calmly allowed the blessing to remain with Jacob and bestowed upon him, in addition, the blessing of Abraham to make him the principal heir of the Abrahamic tradition, what we saw in chapter 28 as well. What had been in Isaac's mind originally, and what transpired to make him change his mind? The greatest difficulty in all this is the fact that heaven obviously went along with all the changes made by the human participants in these events. Evidence is this of the fact that God calls Israel my firstborn son. Remember, Israel is the second name that is given to Jacob. When Moses confronts Pharaoh, God goes along with this. God doesn't say my second-born son. God doesn't say Isaac's second-born son. He calls him the firstborn. Well, how do we understand then what's going on in this relationship and these actions of these different characters throughout the drama? With a story, a parable. The following parable may help explain. There lived a nation whose king had always been chosen by the people. Though the nation chose a descendant of the former king, the people managed to always find a suitable ruler because there was no automatic succession. So stage one, you've got a king, but the king is actually picked by popular acclaim. And yes, it's an inherited position, but the inheritance can go to any of the kids, and the people still get to pick from among the kids, and that means they end up always picking the best of the bunch. One king was so great that the council voted that henceforth the firstborn sons of the kings should automatically succeed. He was a great king. They thought, this is perfect. We've now hit the jackpot. Let's just keep going with this. And they made it an automatic process, that it should be the firstborn and only the firstborn. This law was not subject to periodic review and therefore became unchallengeable. One king had two sons. The elder was self-centered and totally unfit. His younger brother would make him a suitable ruler, would make a suitable ruler. The council's hands were tied, since they were bound by the act of gratitude to an earlier king, which had been enshrined in law. After much debate, they decided that their only hope lay in persuading the older of the two brothers to renounce his claim to the succession voluntarily. They prepared a banquet of the type the older son enjoyed. They pointed out to him that the burdens of office would interfere greatly with his present lifestyle. They succeeded in getting the older son to renounce his claim to the throne. So Akedat's argument through this parable is that Isaac recognizes that Esau would have been unsuitable and Jacob is better for the job. And he is recognizing that, maybe it was supposed to be automatic to go to the firstborn, but maybe we need to rethink that. And maybe if I offer him this banquet, the fat of the land, the dew of the heavens, maybe that will be sufficient, and he'll recognize that he didn't really want the blessing of Abraham anyway. He didn't want to be the number one in the covenant, that wasn't actually a good fit for this son. And thus we're going to go back to picking the right people rather than automatically having the firstborn. And indeed, it's been argued quite successfully and exhaustively that the entire story of the book of Genesis is about why you don't automatically go with the firstborn. That picking the firstborn never works out. They never end up as the main person within the family line, or the person that is most worthy of leadership, and that becomes this trope that is repeated over and over. Questions and comments?
It underscores that kindness. It'd be kind to have the older son. It might be traditional, but kindness and tradition may not be good judgment.
Absolutely, and by this argument as well, it might not have even been good judgment for the elder son. That even though he was brought up to think, I'm the eldest, I'm the one who should be in charge, it's me that's getting this inheritance, that when he stopped and thought about it, according to the parable, it actually would not have been very suitable for him. Definitely not suitable for everyone else, but also not suitable for him. So sometimes that type of automatic traditional behavior is not helping anyone. Even those that look like they are benefiting could actually be harmed by it because they are being railroaded into a position or a life that is not suitable for them, let alone for the rest of the people. Which is why it has to be done with great care, and why, on the whole, the Jewish record with kings is not a very positive one. We are much happier when we don't have to worry about who the son is going to come next that's going to be a king, but rather having more command, more say over who our leaders will be. Reminder in December that Temple Israel will be having our annual board meeting to pick our officers. All right, so let's go ahead though, and because we don't want to paint Esau in such a terrible light, we have to see that this relationship between Esau and Jacob is a little bit more complicated than perhaps it's looked so far. So he called Esau his greater son back in the beginning of chapter 27, when he told him to go out and get me the food for the blessing. This is to teach us that one must flatter wicked men when they are in power. Isaac foresaw that Esau's descendants would dominate the world, and therefore he called him his greater son. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Israel, by having this included in the Torah, inasmuch as Esau is now in control, you must flatter him, for my kingdom is not yet firmly established. But in the future, when my kingdom is firmly established, I will call him to account. As it is said, for liberators shall march up on Mount Zion to wreak judgment on Mount Esau, and dominion shall be the Lord's. So this is a passage from Obadiah, one that's actually found its way into our morning service as one of the transitional parts between the preliminary service and Shacharit. But what it's trying to say is that maybe Esau looks like he is in a good position, but maybe that's just flattery, and maybe that's just reminding us that sometimes we have to bide our time, that sometimes we have to wait. And indeed, Esau became the stand-in for Edom, which was used as a reference for the Roman Empire, and then also was a stand-in in many communities for the Catholic Papal Empire, both of which severely hurt the Jewish communities under their control. And this would be then, under Midrash Tanhuma's interpretation, practical advice. Yes, these are people that are not good, and yes, they are abusive and terrible, And sometimes the only way to survive under that circumstance is to butter them up, right? Just a little bit of flattery, and that will work out. And in the end, Mount Zion will judge Mount Esau, meaning the mountain of Jacob will rule over the mountain of Esau and hold them responsible for the injustices. Now, that last line from Obadiah about Mount Zion dominating Mount Esau, that is a phrase that is very, very filled with meaning, and what we're going to focus on for our last two comments. So Isaac said to Esau in the blessing we saw in 27, "Your dwelling place will be the earth's most fertile, the fatness of the earth, with the dew of the skies above." Isaac confirmed what Esau had requested. This meant that Esau would absorb some of Jacob's spiritual essence. Now, Shnei Luchot HaBrit is a more mystical text, so you'll forgive him for taking this as being a more mystical act, not just talking about the weather and agriculture. But the idea is here, he is arguing, that Esau really did want a blessing, just like we saw back in Akedat Yitzchak. And the blessing that he is given is that he will be able to have some of Jacob's spiritual essence, that Esau and Jacob are not completely cut off from one another. Indeed, the terms Mount Zion and Mount Esau, we saw in Obadiah, respectively, reflect this relationship of Jacob and Esau. Though both are called Mount, Har Zion and Har Esav, something elevated, a raised area, the former is the servant of the latter. You might be wait, hold on. How can Mount Zion be the servant of Mount Esau? Wasn't it supposed to be reversed? Well, in verse 40, and the blessing that he gave to Esau, Isaac told Esau that in the event Jacob did not live up to the assumptions his blessings were based on, there would be a role reversal. Esau would then be able to shake off his yoke of being only an appendix to Jacob. And indeed, this is what happens. Edom, the Edomite area, indeed is for most of the history its own independent group. It is not under or beholden to the nation of Israel, primarily because the nation of Israel became corrupt and had no right to assume that its brother, the Edomites, would be under their control. And that was trying to drive home this notion that the relationship between Sion and Esav, between Jacob and Esau, between Israel and the other powers of the world, is not a stable one. That the relationship is fluctuating depending upon the circumstances of the nations. And with that, we're just going to finish off before opening it up for final comments with an interpretation taken from the prophecy of Bilam when he is giving his prophecy towards Israel in the book of Numbers. A star emerging from Yaakov has begun its journey, a scepter from Israel. It smashes the corner posts of Moab, the foundation of all the descendants of Shem. The poetic language of Bilam becomes clearer when we look at Psalms 22-29. For sovereignty belongs to the Lord, and he rules the nations. This will be demonstrated when liberators shall march up on Zion to wreak judgment on Mount Esau, and dominion shall be the Lord's. All right, so what are we seeing in these three verses linked together? We need to understand the difference between the words ruling and reign. Right, you'll notice back in the version of Psalm, right, for sovereignty, based off reigning, right, melech, the kingly rule, belongs to the Lord. But in the next phrase of that same verse, it moves to the memshelet, the ruling, the memshelah, the idea of being in authority over the nations. And the word reign, ruling and reign both refer to exercises of authority, but there's a difference between them. The word reign, when used in scripture, refers to the rule by a king whose subjects have submitted willingly. They are happy to be under that king's rule. Whereas the word rule is used in scripture when the subjects are unwilling, but unable to shake off the rule by the monarch or dictator. As a general rule, only the Jewish people are described as willingly submitting to God's rule. Throughout the Torah, throughout the rest of Tanakh, the phrase is generally reserved, at least within the current history of those texts, for the Jewish people who are either are submitting or should submit willingly to God's authority. Whereas the Gentile nations described in these verses as being in exile submitted to God's rule under protest. They rebelled against it whenever possible. God imposes his rule upon them in order to frustrate their evil designs against his people. In the eras described both in the Psalms and Obadiah, this situation will have changed, and the Gentile nations will willingly appoint God as their king also. And you can also see this in Zechariah 14:9, which you may know better as being the final line of the Aleinu, where we remind ourselves that at the end of days, the world will all recognize God as king, meaning we will willingly accept God as the authority, and God's name will be one, that we will be united in recognizing that we are under that same king, that there isn't a different God for every nation. This vision from Kedushat Levi is trying to remind us that Esau is not beyond redemption. Esau is not inherently wicked. Indeed, he shares some of the spiritual essence of Jacob. And as a stand-in for all of the nations of the world, yes, they have been guilty over the millennia of rejecting God's rule, of rebelling against God. We know that because they continually act in ways that are barbaric, especially towards us. And we should still recognize that eventually, because they have that spiritual potential, they will absolutely come to recognize and willingly accept God's rules, God's laws, God's reign, God's kingship, if you will. And that may not be a light switch type event, and it is something that I believe personally has been going on now for many centuries, moving the world towards God. And I think we are closer as a world than we used to be. Still problems, still many issues, but we should recognize that there will be a reconciliation between Har Zion and Har Esav, that the mountain of Zion and the mountain of Esau will not be either one over the other, neither Jacob over Esau nor Esau over Jacob, but instead two brothers reconciled to accepting the true blessing that God was trying to give them, and doing so without jealousy, without rivalry, and without any conflict. Unfortunately, it's taking a little bit longer than just the lifetime of those two brothers, although they have their own reconciliation in Vayishlach. But may the ultimate reconciliation happen soon and in our days. Any additional questions or comments that people would like to share?
Thank you for this comment on the difference between reign and ruling. I've seen something similar in an Isaiah commentary, because Isaiah makes that play about kings reigning in the final chapters, whereas humans rule, trying to subject people under their dominion, but ultimately we want a leader.
I think your internet cut out. You went quiet there. Ultimately, we want a leader, and then I couldn't hear anymore. See again, and maybe your internet just went funny for a minute. Try unmuting and.
Okay, I was saying it's in a comment, my commentary on Isaiah. There's a distinction made between reigning, which we see in the final chapters. God reigns, but it's humans who try to rule and try to rule by force, but that the two have to be reconciled in order to bring about the final redemption.
Exactly. And it's something that is very important within Judaism itself. This is not just a lesson for other nations, even though Kedushat Levi is focusing on that, because we know from our own history, especially during the biblical period, that we've had trouble recognizing God as sovereign, that oftentimes we have treated God as ruling us rather than reigning over us. We have often rebelled. I mean, it's like one of our nicknames. And that's something that we have to work on as well, because ultimately God's presence is going to be most powerfully felt in the world when people are willing to actually willingly accept it as being what is right and good for them and the world. But that takes time and it takes effort for each individual to make that journey. All right. Well, thank you all very much.
Oh,
yes.
I had a question.
Yes.
It seems strange to me that Rebecca just vanishes in this story. I mean, she's the one who, I mean, Sarah and Abraham discuss Ishmael and Isaac. There's a kind of parental discussion going on, but
Right.
you don't see that with Rivka. I mean, she just kind of takes this on her own. And I wondered if there's any woman's commentary on that.
Well, I mean, certainly Rivka is the primary designer of many of the events. But there have been a number of commentaries that have tried to wrestle with the different spousal relationship models that we see throughout the first three generations: the Abraham, Isaac, and Hagar, or the Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar relationship, the Isaac and Rivka relationship, and the Jacob, Rachel, Leah, and handmaids relationship. That there are very different styles of how they are involved. Like you said, Sarah and Abraham tend to be much more equal. Abraham seems to debate and weigh the different options that Sarah is bringing and ultimately makes decisions. He does still seem to be the final buck stops there. But with Isaac, it definitely feels more like Rivka is telling him what to do and making the decisions, whether with his knowledge or without. And he is expected to rubber stamp it. He gives his own spin and he gives his own flavor to everything. But she definitely seems to be the primary spouse in terms of family decisions. And then with Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, we see a completely different dynamic where Rachel and Leah become their own unit and their own relationship. And that then is usually handed to Jacob as a fait accompli. Whereas Jacob himself is the one who is sort of left dealing with the repercussions of their relationship and often seems out of his depth when there are problems between them or between them and himself. So yes, all three of these generations have very interesting things to teach us about what to do and what not to do in the spouse relationships.
But Rabbi, in responding to that, in the Matzor on Rosh Hashanah, we read, God tells Abraham, listen to your wife.
Yes.
And the commentary is, Sarah is the greater prophet because Abraham has to listen to Sarah. So this is how Isaac was raised. Sometimes you listen to your wife. She too is a prophet.
Very good point. Yes. Yes, indeed.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Rabbi. It's nice to see you all today.
Good to see you too.